Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zil, and I am actually from Hosseini Association of Calgary. We would like to welcome all of you on behalf of Calgary Anti-Oppression Network. We are here this evening to explore and increase our understanding of Islamophobia within historical and contemporary times. While we do so, it's important to remember that in Canada, Islamophobia is experienced within the context of a colonial settler society that has oppressed and disposed the Indigenous people of this land since contact. That's why we want to begin the evening by acknowledging that we are gathering here on the traditional lands of Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika nations to the south and east of the city, the Stoney and the Tsuut'ina nations to the west of us. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nations, Region 3. We also recognize that the displacement of Indigenous people as a result of colonialism is a global phenomenon. Before we hear from our speakers, the Calgary Anti-Oppression Network wishes to thank the Calgary Public Library for their commitment to public discourse around current issues. We also want to thank the designer of our posters and everyone who helped us to promote the forum. Further thanks goes to those who made financial contributions. If you wish to learn more about the network and the campaigns of the member groups, please check out the literature. On the tables in the foyer, we also have a donation box for those who would like to help us cover the outstanding expenses. Also note that we are videotaping this forum. The cameras will be trained on the speakers, not the audience. Of course, during the question period, your voice will be recorded. We will now have our panelists present. We wish to thank them in advance for being with us in this evening. Our process this evening will be to hear from each of three speakers. After all the presentations have made, we will open the floor to questions. Our first speaker is Dr. Mark Ayyash, who will address Orientalism and colonialism, the historical root of Islamophobia. Mark Ayyash is an assistant professor of psychology and director of the John D. Chastelain Peace Studies Initiative at Montreal University. He teaches and writes in the areas of social and political theory, the study of violence, decolonial movements, as well as cultural and politics in the Middle East, particularly focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. So I would like to invite Mr. Mark. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you for the organizers, for Rosemary, so much for giving me this opportunity here today. As was mentioned, the title of my presentation today is Orientalism and Colonialism, the Historical Roots of Islamophobia. Much of what I'll talk to you about today will be based on the pioneering work of the great theorist and public intellectual, the Palestinian-American Edward Said. 14 years since his death, and he remains a prominent figure in post-colonial theory, literary criticism, and the study of the Palestinian-Israeli struggle. His numerous writings continue to guide and generate debates across a number of different disciplines in academia today. Specifically, I will draw my discussion from two of his major works, Orientalism, which was published in 1979, and Culture and Imperialism, which was published in 1994. We'll also talk a little bit about his 1981 book, Covering Islam. Indeed, let me start with a quote from Covering Islam, where Said argues that despite the almost indefinite plurality of Islam's meanings, he says, and I quote, "Yet there is a consensus on Islam as a kind of scapegoat for everything we do not happen to like about the world's new political, social, and economic patterns. For the right, Islam represents barbarism. For the left, medieval theocracy. For the center, a kind of distasteful exoticism." End quote. Said here was talking specifically about the American media and the discourse of American politicians. And even though this quote comes to us from 1981, it remains, I think, an accurate summary of the situation in our world today. And you can see it in Canada as much as you would in the USA, although I think things are worse there. I know that some Canadians hate hearing that because they fear that it downplays the Islamophobia here. But I think that we can be honest, state that Islamophobia is worse in the US without downplaying its presence and its destructive role here in Canada. Now, I'll come back to this point about the US later at the end and why I say what I'm saying, but let me first unpack that quote that I just read a little bit more, relating it to some examples from the Canadian context. So first, Said points out in that quote how Islam becomes rendered as a scapegoat in our discourse. The use of the term scapegoat is important here because it alerts us to an element of unfairness and indeed of unjustified aggression towards a minority group. That is, a scapegoat, as we understand the term, is a group that is innocent of the charges being laid against it, and that such charges are really only meant to cover over the faults of the community as a whole by signaling out a minority group, blaming them for the ills of the community. This is crucial because it does not only signal that Islam is being unfairly targeted as a minority religion within North American societies, but that behind the term Islam, in the way in which it appears and is used in North American discourse, there's virtually nothing of valid substance. The term itself can be used to refer to any number of, as Said says, political, social, and economic patterns that we don't like. For example, we don't like political patterns trending towards the use of terrorist violence to achieve political goals, so we blame Muslim immigrants for allegedly bringing such violent tactics and destructions to our communities and political system. The point here is not to deny that Muslims have participated or committed any such acts. There are, of course, such cases. But in blaming such patterns on Islam as a scapegoat, such argumentations do not in fact speak to the complexity of these political patterns. For example, they do not speak to the fact that acts of terrorism have been present since basically the modern nation state claimed a monopoly over violence. But more to the point for the purposes of this forum, scapegoating Islam in this way does not speak to Islam itself. It does not speak to Islam as a deep and complex religion with a long and varied history and philosophy. It does not speak to Islam as existing within the contemporary world in a specific political, economic, and social moment. It does not speak to Islam as an ever-changing set of beliefs, values, and ideas that guide human behavior in both predictable and unpredictable ways. The ways in which Islam is not spoken about in any kind of depth is indeed visible, as Said points out in that quote, across the political spectrum. It is very easy to point to the political right and say that they are responsible for Islamophobia and thus wash the hands of centrists and leftists in the process. It is easy to point out blatantly racist and Islamophobic statements and policies, but much more pressing and pertinent is to point out how certain forms of Islamophobia are normalized within centrist and leftist discourse, as these forms play a crucial role in the production and reproduction of Islamophobia. So let's take a couple of quick examples and go through these different forms as they are outlined by Said. He says, for the right, Islam represents barbarism. The most obvious example of this is the Conservative government's Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act under Harper. I won't dwell on this, but even if you agree with the specific amendments to the law in this bill, the very naming of the cultural practices as barbaric, or conversely, the very naming of what we can all agree are heinous acts, such as killing your daughter because he did not like that she was dating, naming these acts, which are already illegal, as cultural practices signifies the ways in which, for the right, Islam as a culture is synonymous with barbarity. Then Said says, for the left, Islam represents medieval theocracy. And here I think we can find the example of the niqab and the recent events in Quebec with their passing of the, for short, State Religious Neutrality Bill. The absurdity of this bill was recently captured in a CBC article. The article starts with a brief summary of the bill, writing, and I quote, basically the bill says, You can walk into a public library, but you can't take out a book. You can sit in a hospital waiting room, but you can't interact with staff. You can drop off your children at daycare, but you can't pick them up. End quote. And this was written after the Liberal government had clarified the bill. So when you look at the justifications for this bill, you'll notice that it's all couched within the language of secularism. Oh, they'll say, you don't understand Quebec. You don't understand how much the struggle towards secularism means to people there, or how much they value secularism. They'll say, never mind that crucifix that hangs on the wall above the Speaker's chair at the Quebec legislature in Quebec City. That's just cultural heritage and tradition. It's not a religious symbol. You don't understand. This is about affirming secularism, not about scapegoating Islam. And I actually sincerely believe that they sincerely believe that they're being consistent in saying that they value secularism above all else, they have a crucifix on the wall of the legislature, and want to ban Muslim women from wearing the niqab, and that they're doing that to help these women. They're, of course, completely inconsistent, and they are, in fact, counterproductive in their measures, as the bill clearly negatively affects the women the most that they supposedly want to help. But this is nothing new. We've seen this before. No group that scapegoats ever admits that it's scapegoating. I doubt any of the legislators have spent any substantive amount of time talking with these women that they supposedly care about, talking with Muslim communities, or reading about the religion and cultures of these communities. There's nothing substantive in what they say. This is merely another case of Islam being viewed as medieval theocracy, that we in the West have supposedly moved beyond, and it is therefore not worth thinking about. And whatever comes to be represented in this manner is also then simply to be eradicated, just like that medieval theocracy of the West has supposedly been eradicated. In a nutshell, they view Islam as a visitor from the dark past, as if these Muslims have learned the secrets of time traveling. Finally, Said says, for the center, Islam represents a kind of distasteful exoticism. And I don't want to get into this too much here for the sake of time, but in a way, you can look at this as the underbelly of why so many people in the center support things like the Quebec bill in a more hidden way. While here there isn't as much of a focus on Islam as being some kind of visitor from the past, there is an element of turning Islam into this mysterious exotic thing, which cannot be possibly understood in a North American society because it is so different and alien. I know we often think of exotic as meaning something good, but you have to remember that first and foremost, the term exotic designates a sort of unbridgeable distance. So when we interact with difference as exotic, we think of difference as so radically altered and unfamiliar that they become exotic and not open to a back and forth sort of dialogue or interaction. And furthermore, the element of distaste towards that difference allows us to become indifferent as to what happens to the lives of those exotic people. So the centrists are basically those that say, when asked about the niqab, for example, they might say something like, oh, I don't know much about that, it sounds so alien to me, and then they stop there. It's the element of just stopping there that is the problematic. And that's what allows for a bill like this to be passed without raising a heck of a lot of attention from the centrist type position. So, in all of these different political forms across the political spectrum, Islam as a term does not appear in any of its rich complexity or texture. And this takes us to the heart of Said's argument in the book Orientalism, and to the question of why it is that Islam specifically takes on this positionality as a scapegoat within North American discourse. So very briefly, Orientalism basically refers to an academic discipline that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries in colonizing centers like England and France. And this discipline's object of study was the Orient, the other, the colonized peoples of the world. The most important feature of Orientalism is that it begins to institutionalize a specific way of dealing with the Orient, as Said puts it, and I quote, by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, end quote. In short, Orientalism can be seen as a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient, end quote. So Orientalism thinks of the Orient as an object for scientific study, as an object to be talked about, not as a thinking and acting human subject that can be spoken with. So this points to the fundamental belief in Orientalism that the Orient could not represent themselves, and therefore the Orientalists would do so in their place and represent them to the West. In doing so, this discourse presented itself as the objective, neutral, and scientific account of the Orient. What would be written in those texts about the Orient would come to define the Orient, regardless of what that Orient might say about themselves. So whether it was in poetry, novels, textbooks, geographies, economic or social or cultural analyses, these texts came to constitute the definitive accounts of the life of the Orient. But in their substance, they were always far from the actual lived experiences of the colonized peoples. They never really spoke to the richness, depth, and texture of life in these communities. These texts were neither objective nor neutral, neither scientific nor definitive. These texts were rather forms of knowledge that were inextricably entangled with the systems of colonial domination and power in which they existed. It is best not to look at this entanglement as knowledge begetting power or as power begetting knowledge, but rather as a complex intertwinement between knowledge and power. So colonial relationships of power and domination made possible certain conditions in which the other could be made into an Oriental subject. At the same time that Orientalism works to produce and reproduce colonial power relationships. So for a quick example, if you're a British colonial officer who is reading a British novel where the Egyptian characters are emotional and irrational and the British characters are rational and offering guidance to those Egyptian characters, then you get a sense of affirmation or reaffirmation of the authority that the colonial government grants you over the local Egyptian subjects, and so on. So Orientalism is not simply a discourse of myths and honest mistakes about the Orient. If that was the case, then we would simply correct the mistakes, demystify the myths, and the problem would just disappear. But that's not the case, since this discourse is more about building and maintaining relationships of power, at the same time that these relations of power require this continuous production and reproduction of Orientalist discourse. So the discourse itself is not about a substantive engagement with a given subject matter like Islam, attempting to come to a comprehensive understanding of that subject matter. But it is about producing the subject matter in question in a specific way so as to allow for the continued domination of that subject. So what is behind the terms that are discussed in Orientalist discourse, terms like Islam, is not the substantive real thing called Islam, but rather a certain configuration of power. Within Orientalist discourse, it doesn't actually matter whether the Muslim is indeed really backwards. What matters is that the Muslim be posited as backwards, as something that is lacking guidance, so as to justify the colonial authority over that subject. Said makes clear in his work that these features of Orientalism are not simply things that have happened in the past in the 18th and 19th centuries, but very much present in the political and intellectual culture of North American society today. Yes, some of the apparent colonial power structures, like the old colonial government, did disappear to a certain extent in the post-World War II era, but the colonial power relationships have remained, and they very much shape our world today. The former colonial centers still control and maintain a certain kind, I thought I had 20. So I'm good. So the former colonial centers still control and maintain a certain kind of post-colonial and neo-colonial authority over the formerly colonized. And this is more true of the US than it is of Canada, coming back to that point of why I say it's worse in the US than it is in Canada, mostly because their strategic interests in the Islamic region are just that much greater than they are here. Hence, you find more of an Orientalist discourse there than you would here. not because we're better people necessarily, although we kind of are still. So the interest that American intellectuals and politicians have in Islam are not simply innocent interests in the lives of others. They are interested in Islam and Muslims precisely because of American strategic interests in regions where people are predominantly Muslim. They are interested in Islam and Muslims precisely because the movement of peoples from these regions to North America, American societies comes along with the economic exploitation of those regions, which forces people on the bottom of the global economic order to follow the movement of capital on the top of that order. Many of the intellectual and political leaders that appear in the news that you watch, write op-eds in the papers that you read, and entertain you in various late-night talk shows like Bill Maher, who I'm actually a fan of except on this issue, speak to you about Islam with the certainty of an expert who has studied the peoples of Islam and can give you the definitive, accurate, and objective account of Islam. But the majority of them have never truly bothered with trying to really interact with or to comprehensively understand Islam and Muslim communities. They often couch their criticisms of Islam within neutral-sounding and innocent, grandiose-sounding frameworks such as secularism or freedom of speech or the democratic public sphere. But make no mistake, most of these forms of questionings are not at all leading us towards an ever greater understanding of each other, but are very much about the maintenance and reproduction of power relationships in our world today. This is not to say, and this is the point that is systematically developed in Edward Said's book, Culture and Imperialism, this is not to say that we ought to stop writing about each other across our cultural and religious differences. Far from it. What Said urges us to do is to first acknowledge the power relationships in which our interactions take place. Second, to try to address the power imbalance, which is very difficult to do, but I would argue most of the time just making the effort will go a long way. Third, understand and be vigilant against the possibility that what you say, paint, or draw can have detrimental effects on already marginalized and oppressed groups. Fourth, and most crucially, work hard in moving away from speaking about the other and towards speaking with the other. For Said, we must understand that we are indeed capable of forming what he calls community of interpreters of each other's cultural practices, values, ideas, and beliefs, because we are indeed much more connected than what we would like to admit. And in such a community of interpreters, where reciprocity of communication is practiced and the power dynamics brought to the forefront, we can and should ask tough questions of each other. We can and should offer criticisms of each other, challenge each other, but we ought to do it thoughtfully, respectfully, in a learned and constructive manner. So, for all of those non-Muslims who are sincerely concerned about, let's say, the religious police and honor killings in Saudi Arabia, the first step is not to go shopping for a white horse and a knight's armor. Save yourself that trouble and simply go talk to Saudi women who are already leading that struggle against these crimes. And what you'll often find is that they can indeed use your help. Not to draw up for them a plan of action, they usually already have that. Not to teach them about civilized forms of behavior in contrast to their barbaric ways. They already think those practices are heinous crimes. You'll often, not always, but you'll often find that they need your help in stopping your own government from funding and or selling weapons to the forces that are killing them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark. Now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Shirley Steinberg, who will speak about re-inscribing the culture of fear and Islamophobia, Hollywood's Muslim and Arabs. Shirley R Steinberg is Research Professor of Youth Studies at the University of Calgary. The authority of many books and articles, she is an international scholar, media columnist, and community activist with the research interest in social justice, anti-racism, and critical empowerment. Please welcome Ms. Dr. Shirley Steinberg.
Hello, it's so good to see everyone here, and thank you so much for coming in one of Canada's most important holidays. Thanks, Mark, for that. I'm certainly miss Edward Said. After 14 years, he had a tremendous effect on how I see the world and his work. And I appreciate what you had to say. I think it was excellent. I want to talk today about just taking on from actually Said's notion of Orientalism and the notion of how we construct an Arab or a Muslim. And I do say both together because, as we know, not all Arabs are Muslims and not all Muslims are Arabs, yet they all seem to get junked together. You can be from Indonesia, but if you have a hijab on, all of a sudden you're treated like an Arab. So there's all kinds of miscommunication about exactly what we're talking about when we talk about certain terms. And I want to look at one of the most colonizing ideas and forces in our world today, and that's the media. And I want to look at how Hollywood constructs a lot of the ways we see Muslims and Arabs. And I want to say that in some of the examples I'm going to show you, they definitely were not from Hollywood. In fact, a lot of Hollywood is now taking a lot of Israeli films and television shows and rewriting them for the American audience, and so is quite complicit in persevering and promoting a lot of the stereotypes we see. Mark, can you see if my glasses are in there, just sitting there in a little black case? I thought I had to read something, and I can't remember. Thank you. How we see Muslims and Arabs through Hollywood is in different ways. And as a critical theorist, I always look at how power works. And if I'm examining something, I want to know how power works with this. And I believe how power works with Islamophobia in today's society is very much through the screen. It's very much through the images and the stereotypes that are continually played. In fact, I was thinking today that it's more your age, but when Back to the Future first came out, those movies, I think it was like the 80s-ish or something, one of the very first movies had a big van full of kind of that generic Arab terrorist that we see in the van. And the whole movie started with an Arab terrorist attack. Of course, it had nothing to do with the movie, but it seemed to be exciting to have people in this scene. And it's before we actually had the notion of Arabic terrorists, but following up with the notion of barbarism, which is certainly a part that's always played in that, it seemed like this kind of just ad hoc addition to the movie. We see this a lot in a lot of Hollywood work. But in today's society, I'm an advocate that we must understand media and that we don't. That we must be able to facilitate children and other people to understand if they don't see what we're seeing, we need to name it and have that conversation. And languages and images are used consistently to indoctrinate people into hatred. So I ask the question, how do we tell our story? How do we make sense of images? So I'm going to talk very quickly into my journey in how I started to construct a notion of Arabs and Muslims. So many thousands of years ago, there was a movie called Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole, blonde, blue-eyed British boy who managed to be T.E. Lawrence and saved all of this barbaric peninsula called Arabia, and historically this particular lieutenant did have something to do with the partitioning and the ending of tribal states in Arabia and creating different countries. But it was so interesting, and I always look at this because there was always, and this is a stereotype you see a lot in Hollywood shows that deal with Muslims and Arabs, and there was this gorgeous Omar Sharif, who is Egyptian by birth, who was a prince who was aiding this blonde general to save the entire Arabic people. And there was always that image of the sidekick in a lot of these shows. And if you watch Indiana Jones and you see Arabic people that are Muslim people working with usually the Anglo, who is the star of the show, you will once again see that kind of sidekick that's brought along. And I think that that's part of an image that Hollywood uses to kind of validate the colonialism and the person who is kind of an interluder, who walks into a place and starts to colonize and change it. And then my memory goes back to the late 60s when I saw a Time magazine article about, and it was called The Plight of the Arab Refugees. And I didn't know there were Arabic refugees. It was the first time I'd ever seen that. All I had known is that Israel was a country. I'm from a Jewish family, and I didn't understand that. And it became very important for me to understand what was going on. And so that's my very first memory of understanding this conflict that was happening that had not been made known to me by my own people and my family. And it wasn't until I was in Israel, not too long after, well, a few years after that, that I remember going out of the city of Jerusalem and seeing all these tents. And so it was in the 80s, and I said to somebody, what is that? And I think I'd never realized exactly what it was like to be Palestinian in those days, and the continued days. And the displacement of citizens of a country. And it was a very important turning point again to me, because I started to question, of course, the partitioning of Israel and why exactly this was not a conversation in any of the history books or things that I had been taught. That same time, a little later, in the 60s, Robert Kennedy was killed. And my big memory of that, not so much, I mean, of course, it was tragic to see an assassination, but the continued rhythm of the news every day, for days, and even to this day, you will hear it if they mention an anniversary, that he was killed by Saran, and this is the important part, a man of Jordanian descent. And so my knowledge of the killer of Kennedy was couched in the man's origin. That became very significant in creating my consciousness. A few years later, Munich happened. Munich was a tragedy for many, many people, and this is the 1970 Olympics, 72 Olympics, sorry. And just quickly, a group captured the Israeli, I think it was the track team, and held them hostage. And I remember that. I was in university and we watched it for a long time, the entire week. And as you may or may not know, by the end of the week, this was in Munich, the German government, instead of doing anything about this at the time, they suggested, created a bargain with the group that had kidnapped the Israelis to allow them to go to the airport. And they were hoping then that the athletes would be turned over to them, and the kidnappers would leave. And as you may know, the Germans waited till everyone got to the airport and basically wholesale murdered everyone. The Israeli athletes and the kidnappers all together were killed. So Steven Spielberg made a movie about Munich, 1972, a very tragic part of Olympic history. What was significant to me was he made a movie just recently called Munich, telling the story. And this is about images. So at the end of the movie, it's fast forward. the world has changed. And you see people in Brooklyn, you see some of the negotiators, you see some of the news people, you even see some of the kidnappers who had escaped, where they had ended up years later. But it's basically right after the Munich shooting and the Munich deaths, and you're just watching this, and your mind is on Munich. Your mind is on what happened in this incredibly sad story. And the very last scene is what's significant to me, because this is what you see. Now, of course, these towers didn't look like that in those days. This is a complete Hollywoodization that has nothing to do at all with Munich. However, Spielberg took the opportunity to take a story from this context and end it with that context. And that picture there has such important significance to people after 9/11. And so what you've seen is this other conversation we never have about what happens when images are mixed, what happens when different sounds come on, what happens when different music is played, how terror through Hollywood starts to be manufactured. Then fast forward to the all-famous movie Disney's Aladdin, 1992. Some of you may have it in your home, or your kids may have watched it at someone else's house. This is what's significant. I won't sing it to you, but this is the opening song. I come from a land, a faraway place, where caravan camels roam, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home. This is how the original Aladdin came to people's homes, and many still have this film in their film library. It took tremendous objections from the American Arabic Anti-Discrimination League to demand that Disney change this language. But this is very important when you look at this language, because this language is exactly going back to how Said talks about the Orientalization and the concept of barbarism, and so does Jack Shaheen as well. But that idea that it can even be playfully sung in a Disney song like it's a joke, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. The reducing of an entire culture of people to such a psychotic, crazy image, and hey, it's barbaric. In fact, when I've done analysis with people's responses to different movies and television shows, barbaric and barbarism and barbarian are the words that come up more than any other word in content analysis when we look at movies that detail Arabs and Muslims. Then we fast forward to 1995, Oklahoma City bombing, when, of course, I was actually in San Francisco, and, of course, within an hour, all of a sudden, every single news agency said it was suspected Arabic terrorism. That was everywhere on the news. They were stopping anyone who had any kind of dark skin in that area of Oklahoma, in Texas. Mexicans were being stopped. Indians were being stopped. Everybody who looked that they could possibly be Arabic was being stopped, or Muslim. And of course, we find out that it was Timothy McVeigh, a good Catholic boy, who did it all himself. Of course, there was never once an apology by the media, never once, any kind of taking it back. And this never was called a terrorist attack. I believe 160 people were killed. Then we talk about the killings, the bombings in Boston during a race. Men that were not affiliated by anything, Kosovo men, it was considered terrorism. And images become very important. We start to see images like this, always with a white savior taking care of the bloodiest of children or women, instilling in our minds the notion of terrorism. And yet, once again, this was three men who were very, very disturbed angry, and had no ties whatsoever to any kind of organized Islamic group. So we ask the question of what exactly is the notion of a terrorist? What is a terrorist? Can there be a white terrorist? Can a Canadian or an American Anglo be a terrorist? Are all Muslims and Arabs terrorists? According to Hollywood, this is often how they're depicted. So part of the message, because we don't have media literacy in our schools, it's not a conversation, and yet I would argue that there's nothing that's more important than media to our children at this point. They are more influenced by media than anything else. But that idea is learning to call out a media stereotype, just like the Arab American Committee did, to teach children to object to the images, to insist that schools have media literacy, and insist that nobody could possibly be part of this group, that it is not a consistent effort by all Arabs and Muslims. This idea of stopping this stereotyping of all Arabs and Muslims in the interest of how Hollywood treats us. These images, once again, you can see why images are so powerful, because the fear is created. And yet when three white men walked up to this man, his wife, and his sister, and murdered them in cold blood in North Carolina because she had a hijab on, it was never called terrorism. In fact, it was never even defined as a hate crime. Images like Not Without My Daughter, looking at Persian barbarism, Indiana Jones, Sleeper Cell, an Israeli show actually. These are the kind of shows that are brought to Canada and the United States with an agenda to create and to reinforce the hatred of Arabs and Muslims. Right before the election, or the Democratic Convention in 2012, a movie called Obsession was distributed to 26 million homes in the United States through the newspapers, through big newspapers. In fact, a newspaper that probably some of us look for jobs, the Chronicle of Higher Education, actually had a copy of this in it. If you just look at the graphics on this and see the rifle on the end and the name of it, Radical Islam's War Against the West, we're not even inquiring as to what on earth is a radical Islamicist. What is a radical Muslim? How do we come up with the word radical? Do we have radical Catholics, radical Jews, radical Protestants? What exactly is radicalism? But this notion of radicalization has been taken over. The language has been used to become part of our dictionary. The dictionary that teaches us about radical Islam, but yet it's never been defined. Islamists, terrorists, the quotes like war against the world, they hate our freedom, death to America, Islam will dominate the world. 24, one of the most popular shows on TV, constant Islamic terrorism, Islamic barbarism. Homeland, some of you might watch it. Homeland is actually a product of Israel as well. It's now produced in the United States. This is one of the most interesting posters I've ever seen. When I teach semiotics, the science of symbols, I think this is very significant, because it's a story of a woman who's an FBI agent, but that notion of the faceless, nameless, terrorist women totally covered. You see how this kind of picture could create fear, worry. So I talk about creating a counter-narrative, telling a different story, in metaphorically lifting the veil, but keeping the veil on the women who choose to wear it. Questioning what exactly are we doing in Canada? Are we responding to Bill 62? How do we object to Islamophobic images or news reports? There is not a tremendous amount right now supporting the women in Quebec. Indeed, the argument is that it's a feminist argument to keep women told what they should wear. This is something that I advocate now, that we should be bringing consciousness to this, having this conversation about the absolute ignorant media, the attitude that has created what Bill 62 became. I don't believe any images are innocent. I believe all images have a story and they need to be talked about. They need to be fought. So many people are so afraid, and yet there's nothing to be afraid of. It's the images that make us the most afraid. And just the last two slides I'm going to show you. These are done by an artist called The Narcissist. He's an Iranian, or excuse me, he wouldn't like that, an Iraqi Muslim in Montreal who has created a counter-narrative with his own hip-hop. And he's done one video called Fatwa, another called Hamdallah, showing that there is no face of a Muslim, that Muslims look like everyone else. In closing, I advocate the point of media is to teach peace.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shirley Steinberg. Now I would like to invite our last speaker, Dr. Mujtaba Mahdavi, who will present Caught Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Muslims, Islamophobia, and Violent Extremism in a Global Context. Mujtaba Mahdavi is Associate Professor of Political Science and the ECMC Chair in the Islamic Studies in the University of Alberta. He has published on the contemporary social movements in the Middle East, modern Islamic political thoughts, and socialism and post-Islamism. Now I would like to invite Mr. Mahdavi to come on the stage. Please give him a big round of applause.
Good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all for being here. My colleagues already told you things I wanted to say, but I would like to actually share things in a very perhaps simple language and of course followed by question and answer. What I would like to share with you tonight is that I simply want to suggest that ordinary Muslims are caught between a rock and hard place, between Islamophobia on the one hand and on the other hand, violent extremism. But I would like also to suggest that Islamophobia at the current time actually is a global phenomenon. Just look at things happening to Muslims in Muslims Rohingya of Myanmar, right? Things happening to these guys by Buddhist fundamentalism, or the rise of Hindu fundamentalism in India, or the rise of white supremacist and right-wing populism in United States, Europe, and to a lesser extent in Canada. So there is actually a global phenomenon, if you wish, with respect to the Islamophobia. But what is Islamophobia? Let me first suggest that what is not Islamophobia. Islamophobia is not actually about, if you are criticizing Muslims or basically offering some sort of even radical critique of a particular interpretation of Islam or reading of Islam, this is not really about Islamophobia. It's because Muslims already actually offered a radical critique of some of their own interpretation. So if there is a civilized, academic, of course, polite and serious debates, that's not really Islamophobia. Islamophobia, in very simple language, is racializing the other. It's about hate. It's about racializing and exclusion of the other. And the other usually are the minorities, religious, ethnic, and or even sexual minorities. Islamophobia is about racism. Things other religious and ethnic minorities experience before and now. Anti-Semitism, black, native and indigenous people, sexual minorities, gay, lesbian, and others. So basically, we should understand Islamophobia in this context, very briefly marginalizing the minority. Equally problematic, I think, following the discussion on Orientalism, Islamophobia also, it's about singling out Islam as an exceptional religion and or culture, which is exceptionally immune to think rationally, to democracy, to peace, love, or all the good things we have in the West. So the whole phenomenon of Islamic and or Muslim exceptionalism is basically one element of Islamophobia, that Islam as a religion and culture is exceptionally different from other. So this singling out Islam/Muslim is definitely one major component of Islamophobia. Well, we know that, of course, violence happens everywhere. There are other, I just mentioned things happening to Muslim Rohingya. But Buddhism, Buddhism is supposed to be the most, of course, peaceful religion. But you do have actually Hindu and even, of course, Buddhist fundamentalism. So generalization definitely is, of course, major problem, as we have discussed this before, of course, about the whole discourse of Islamophobia. This brings me to the issue of Islamophobia is one among many and several forms of Orientalist discourse. What do we mean by this, I guess, Orientalism discourse, as Mark already talked about this? Let me just add a few quick points about, I guess, the links between Islamophobia and Orientalism. In Islamophobia discourse, Islamophobes basically offer a very vast generalization of Muslims. Muslims living from, in Indonesia to Tunisia, Arabs, non-Arabs, Muslims with different ethnic, of course, groups. There is no differentiation between gender, class, nationality, politics, different non-religious tradition. It's a very wholesale argument about Muslim and Islam. Vast generalization, ignoring diversity, ignoring different interpretation of Islam. Basically, that's the number one problem. The second problem is that Islamophobia offers a very static reading of Islam and Muslim. So basically, Muslims living in 1500 years ago, nothing has changed. It's a very static reading of Islam and Muslim. There is no dynamism. There is no internal dynamism. Things are actually stuck in the history. And since there is no dynamism, there is no change from within. So if you want to actually see change, you should actually impose it upon them from outside. Regime change, intervention, this kind of stuff, because this culture is static and stagnant, and there is absolutely no way you can actually bring some meaningful change. So, of course, these are some, I just want to share with you some examples of these, of course, Islamophobia forces. But now, another element of Islamophobia is ignoring multiple identity of Muslims. Muslims are so many things at the same time, right? It's not that you simply can reduce the identity of Muslim into one single giant element of religiosity, right? Even the religiosity is so diverse and, of course, multiple. Then Islamophobia also creates a false binary and dichotomy between Islam and the West. All the good things, of course, belongs to the West. Democracy, secularism, quote-unquote, rationality, whereas Muslims cannot really understand or appreciate this stuff. This is a poll actually by, I guess, Gallup poll, and it simply suggests that we should really challenge this very naive, simplistic, I guess, dichotomy between Islam and the West. And the idea that religion of Islam is the problem. If you're religious, you cannot appreciate democracy or this kind of stuff. So you see here, Indonesia, the largest Muslim countries, it's quite religious, but at the same time, it's actually a very, it's a democratic society. Egypt, Pakistan, Palestine, Turkey, and Iran. So religion is important, but at the same time, they very much appreciate guarantee, for freedom of speech and democratic values. So I don't really see I don't really see a dichotomy and binary here between the so-called West and Islam, which is very prevalent in the Orientalist, Islamophobic discourse. Another problem, I think, with the Islamophobia discourse is that it's very much religious-centered, and it's very much about the text of Muslim and their religiosity with absolutely no reference to political context, social context. So for these guys, if there is a violation of women's rights, or I don't know, there is violence or anything like that, the only thing you really need to do is just open up the religious text, go back to 14, 15 centuries ago, and try to understand what the heck is going on. There is absolutely no reference to the contemporary current politics that why actually there is violence or why there are, of course, violation of human rights or, of course, women's rights and other minorities. So these pictures, of course, suggest that this comes actually from the Danish cartoons in 2006, or the recent, of course, cartoons in Charlie Hebdo's, of course, you can find it. It's a very textualist, religious-centered, reductionist understanding of Islam and Muslim. Similarly, you can see this kind of stuff. If there is so-called suicide bombing or, of course, violence, it's basically about certain reading of religion, and that's it. It has nothing to do with war, violence, occupation, or any kind of political context. So the context is very much absent. The reality is that some of the actually Islamophobes, like some Muslims, you have to be a good Muslim for them, using Mahmoud Mamdani's phrase, good Muslims versus bad Muslims. So there is a way you can be a good Muslim for Islamophobe if you pursue their goals. For instance, in a classic case is the way United States helps Mujahideen in Afghanistan war, right? Or a kind of funding, financial funding on arming some of the extremists or radical Muslims in Libya or even in Syria, or selling arms perhaps to Saudi Arabia, and of course having a great business. So it's quite possible to work with some so-called good Muslims while basically ignoring the ordinary, Muslims. And that's definitely one major problem. When it comes to the whole issue of violence, of course, the rise of ISIS, Daesh is a great example for Islamophobe that, of course, ISIS and Daesh represent the main feature of Islamic civilizations. And if you really want to understand why there is something wrong with Islam, look at what they are doing. In this particular approach, the problem is that they don't really talk about what socio-political factors contributed to the rise of ISIS. They don't really talk about the American invasion of Iraq. They don't really talk about the role of proxy war in Syria. They don't really talk about the spread of a particular reading of Wahhabi school of thought, which comes actually from Saudi Arabia, the closest ally of US in the Middle East. And they don't really talk about the exclusion and marginalization of course, youth. So it's very much about religion, Prophet Muhammad, 14th, 15th centuries ago, with no actual socio-political context. And that's definitely a major problem in reading, events in this context. So if this is the problem, perhaps what we can do briefly is more education about diversity of our cultures, Islam's and others, and different interpretation of different cultures, particularly different interpretation within Islam. But at the same time, we also need to be active and, very active in united front against all forms of racism, politics of hate, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, any kind of thing against black, LGBTQ, or marginalization of any sexual or other forms of minority. The next things we really need to fix it in order to deal with the problem of Islamophobia is fixing our foreign policy. How many times you want to repeat the same mistake in the Middle East? Regime change, intervention, destroying these countries, and then every single, 4, 5 years, 10 years or so, you actually invade countries and of course create this sort of problem. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and today's perhaps some of these guys are talking about Iran. So I never ever actually learn a lesson about their mistakes or their political agenda. So fixing foreign policy and abandoning the politics of regime change, and of course, look at the waves of immigrants and refugees. They've shaken the whole foundations of Europe and very much contributed to the rise of right-wing populism. So we have to actually seriously talk about the impact of foreign policy in the rise of these problems. And the last things perhaps we can do about, dealing with the politics of Islamophobia and providing some sort of solution is that we should not get fooled by politics of demagogy of some of the politicians who actually, in domestic politics, use Islams, Muslims, immigrants, other minorities as an scapegoat to ignore the real problem. So we all have fear, definitely, but we should not definitely fall into their traps of course, turning us against each other. So definitely, scapegoating is their goal, and we have to face with that and challenge this problem. To conclude, I would suggest that no culture is perfect. No religious, ethnic culture or person is perfect. We all have their own weaknesses and problems, and we really need seriously talk about the weaknesses. A clear and honest and critical discussion and debates with all of us. But Islamophobia is not really about a critical discussion. It's about hate and racialization, and we should really, really make a clear distinction between the two. When it comes to Canada, relatively and comparatively, multiculturalism is being working here better compared to Europe and Australia. What we need to do in order to challenge the politics of Islamophobia is basically deepening and broadening the politics of multiculturalism in a very, very meaningful way in order to celebrate our differences and in order to appreciate the diversity of Canadian society. So with that, I know this is very hard. I know that if you look at the situation, of course, it looks like quite impossible, but I always actually liked Antonio Gramsci's very, famous statement, an Italian public intellectual who says that I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will, and we really need to, of course, use this hope and will to overcome these problems. So I'll stop here, and hopefully we have good critical discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahdawi. I would like you all to please join me in thanking all of our speakers who shared all their thoughts and knowledge and insights with us this evening. Please thank you them. We will now open the floor for questions. We asked that you be respectful and keep your questions as brief as possible. They may be addressed to the panel as a whole, to an individual. If you would like to ask a question, please come up to one of our microphones.
I did want to start by thanking you because it was a very interesting panel in my opinion. I want to give you a little bit of background first before I start my question. I'll make it as brief as possible. I'm a dual citizen of Canada and France, and I grew up in France actually. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and we saw several images tonight about cartoonists such as the South Park people, also people at Shirley Hebdo and at the newspaper as well. And I understand that drawings don't always consider everything in the context that they're trying to put out. Sorry, I might explain this differently. Some of the arguments that are made by Shirley Hebdo, and I'll speak about them specifically just because I know a little bit more about their newspaper. They would say sometimes that the people that they're specifically talking about and directing their cartoons about are about specific fundamentalist groups, whether that's in any religion or even other. Yeah, so Shirley Hebdo and the context that I understood when they were describing what they're trying to put out there as an idea is specifically targeted or referencing specific fundamentalist groups, and again, within a variety of religions and other topics that they may talk about. And images are powerful, as mentioned, and they do have an impact. How do you, do you believe that such cartoons participate in the misunderstanding of certain of these religions, and possibly as well in the increase of, in this case, Islamophobia, and why?
Absolutely. In fact, I was just in France, and they still have the Charlie Hebdo little stencils on the graffiti wall. I disagree that they were targeting terrorist groups. They had insulting cartoons showing the Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him. To me, there's a responsibility that we don't seem to have a conversation about. We might have freedom of speech, but how do we look at that freedom? Is that freedom fair to insult and humiliate other people? And I would say that what Charlie Hebdo was, I certainly am sorry people died, but I think they left themselves open for anger. And I don't think that any of their cartoons, the specific ones that caused the reactions, I don't think that they served to create anything good in the world. And so while I think they have the right to publish what they want, there's a conversation we don't have about responsible citizenship that I find disturbing.
And if I may just add to that, I think this goes to some of the points that I was making in terms of doing it in a learned and constructive manner. So let's assume, given them a benefit, obviously what happened to them is indefensible, and I won't defend that as atrocious thing. But let's assume that they are wanting to just criticize the fundamentalists. If you are interested in that, and you want to dialogically engage with the Muslim community about that, then maybe you ought to figure out why it is that they don't want the Prophet drawn. So I'm not religious. I'm interested, and I'm not an expert on Islam, by the way, either. But I know enough to know when someone isn't. So to borrow Saeed's term, to do a secular criticism or critique of Islamic history, part of the reason why the Prophet forbade the drawing of him is, from what I understand, he didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted attention being given to the word of the Quran and not to himself as a person. That was part of his, what he saw as a shortcoming of Judaism and Christianity, which he follows, but he thought they went wrong in that they ended up being religions that worshipped figures like Jesus or Moses. And he didn't like that. To him, to properly move beyond polytheism, which is really Islam's main nemesis, not the other religions, it's polytheism. To move beyond polytheism, you had to stop this worship of idols. So don't draw me, he said. Now, there's a legitimate criticism of many followers of Islam, especially in the Muslim world, that go and protest these drawings, and they don't even know these complicated reasons. But if you want to enter that conversation, to me, and you want to do it responsibly, then you ought to learn some of these reasons. And perhaps the best way to constructively engage with this community is to not go and break their number one most important fundamental core law. So freedom of speech, yeah, if you want to throw a tantrum and just say, I want to be able to say whatever I want, whenever I want it, then okay, then I'm going to call that what that is, right? It's not a constructive engagement. It's just someone saying, I'm in a position of power and I can do this and then I want to do it. So that's where that difference comes in.
Add to that, I guess, I think these cartoons very much suffered from the same problem of cultural essentialism and reductionism, because, and apparently these guys, Shirley those guys actually were kind of anarchists, right? Not really right-wing. And anarchism basically means you really should care about the weak, those who actually are in the position of, I guess, weak, and not the powerful. I would ask these guys, obviously we protect and support their freedom of speech. However, the question is a constructive and responsible engagement. What does Muhammad, a historical figure lived in 14 centuries ago, 15 centuries ago, has something to do with the problems of contemporary today, today and contemporary politics of second and third Muslim generation living in shanty towns of capital cities of Europe. If we are serious about the problem of today, right now, and we are not really reproducing Orientalist discourse, culturalism, and we are really serious about talking about politics of today and problems of today, we should really care about their own problem. The problem of this second and third generations Muslim, right? I don't really see by having a cartoon of Muhammad, you could have a serious, this is not about taboo or I don't know, any kind of religious sort of argument. It's a very secular, actually, critical argument. So this is a kind of, I guess, critique I do have, and I would like to see what they actually can respond to this sort of argument, yeah.
Well, thank you for your answers, yeah.
First of all, I'd like to thank the panelists very much for their analysis. And I was wondering if you had the opportunity to say one thing about what we in Alberta should do to fight Islamophobia, what would you suggest? Thank you.
Just one thing, huh?
Maybe two.
Oh, man. Islamophobia, the tacit implications, the institutionalized, the insidiousness of any kind of hatred is pretty frightening. There's no reporters here? As I work in the Faculty of Education, I collaborate with schools very loosely. And it's come to my attention from parents, from the Syrian parents of the kids I work with, that the kids aren't learning English very well. And in my investigation, I find out that there's a a program that all our Syrian kids are put into that is siloed off. They come here and they're not put into the regular school program. So they're in an Arabic environment learning English, and they're not learning English. They're also not meeting any kids. So a couple months ago, I went to Western Canada High because I know people there, and I sort of gathered up about 15 Canadian kids to meet the Syrian kids and had them spend the day together. And the Syrian kids told me this is the first time some had been here 18 to 20 months, that they had never met another Canadian kid. So we're talking, an institutionalized racism that is replicated in our system of schooling. And it all comes from that kind of white savior mentality that I talk about a lot, that idea of what's good for them. Well, we've all seen in Alberta how good it worked for the First Nations people and for women. I mean, what's good for them always seems to be a dominant cultural power comment. And I think we need to be more aware of what's happening here in Alberta with a very large population that you probably don't see much because they're all up in the Northeast because that's where they've basically been put. We just elected a mayor again who is Muslim, evidently, but makes lots of really great videos and movies and smiles a lot, and he's real jolly, but he hasn't given a squat penny to any institute or group of us who are working with refugees. I think that, so I'm an on-the-ground activist, so my concern in Alberta is what I see as an institutionalized Islamophobia about the new coming people from Syria. So mine's very on the ground, my comment.
I'm not as good at this as Shirley is, so she could probably just say another one for me, and that would be the best thing to do. But maybe I'll just add, instead of going on the policy side, which is not my strong suit, just in your daily life, just be aware that this is an issue that is faced by your fellow citizens here. And if you see someone or being discriminated against or being given a dirty look, I'm not asking you to go and pick fights with people, but even if you just smile at that person and say hi to them, you know what, that will actually make them feel a little bit better about their day-to-day interactions. So maybe just do something about your own behavior in your day-to-day life. I'm not one, though, to say that that's a substitute for policy changes, so policy changes remain number one to me, but you can also do something on the sort of the day-to-day interactions.
Just by what you're saying, though, just one thing I'm thinking is my friends that wear niqab or hijab is, you ask the women that wear head coverings and face coverings, and they will tell you that people will look away consciously. They won't hold the door open for them. There's almost this treatment of the invisible woman. And so I would say this would be doing exactly what Mark says. Make a point, especially with a woman who's wearing religious covering, to engage her eyes. Let her know that you actually consider her a human being, because I really don't think it happens very often.
Behave normally with them.
Yeah.
Sure, and I would add, as I briefly mentioned before, more education about diversity of Islams and Muslims, right? It's quite diverse. We are talking about 1.6 billion populations, and there are many, I guess, ways of interpretation of Islams and Muslims. So education is definitely something we need to do. More funding for more institutions and programs on Islamic studies, Middle East studies, definitely. These are very, very helpful things. And ideally, policy change. I mean, yes, there are elements of extremism in this particular culture and, of course, ethnic religious groups. But we really need to talk about serious stuff, why and how we also contributed to this so-called extremism. I mean, why, for God's sake, you are selling arms to a country in this region who actually killed innocent fellow Muslims simply for making profits, right? Or why you are supporting some of these radical so-called Islamists for the sake of their own politics. And this is not new. This has been during the Cold War, in post-Cold War. And so we really need to address this stuff. And then when it comes to domestic politics, I mean, any politician who actually tries to find Muslims or other minorities as a scapegoat, we should have an open, critical discussion about what are the real issues right now. If you are unable to fix the economic problem, don't look for an scapegoat of religious minority or ethnic minority. Let's talk about the real issues. So these are some of the stuff, of course, at the broader, perhaps federal level we can do. But I know it's hard, and we really need to push further and further. Yeah.
You know, Canadians are so nice, and I'm American, that's why I'm not so nice. But Canadians are so nice, and they also say they're sorry a lot. But it's time to name things as they are and state things. And I think that that becomes important, to support policies, to make it known what you feel. That's why we have MLAs and MPs, that idea of saying things. Little things make a difference.
And just to add a very quick note to that, sending letters to your representatives works. Most representatives assume for every letter that they get, and the numbers are different depending on different politicians, but usually they assume that another 5 people in their constituency believes the exact same thing as that letter does. So imagine in a situation if someone gets 1,000 letters, they're sitting there going, that's about 5,000 votes that wins or loses elections. So the stuff matters. They do listen. So sending letters to your MLAs. And sorry, and speaking of policy a little bit, I was just thinking in terms of Alberta, but once you go national, then of course there's more. Then it becomes, the policies become a lot bigger, talking about international selling weaponry, the Bill 62 if we get out of Alberta as well, and so on.
Thanks for all the good words, and I agree with all what has been said. 2 quick questions and a brief comment. One question about hate crimes. Is there a way in which we as citizens can find more about hate crimes which have been enacted upon us or those that we know, in terms of legislature? What's a means or a way that we can learn more about that and activate it? Another question kind of to Mark. You all talked about education. I'm very conscious and pleased that you do now have the minor in peace studies at Mount Royal University, which has been a long time coming. Are these issues being discussed within the courses within that program, or is it still developing? I recognize it's still a new program. So curious about peace studies as an avenue to explore this in Calgary. And then a quick comment to follow up on that first question with the cartoons. Some of you may be aware that the Danish newspaper, about 6 months before the cartoons of Mohammed were published, were proposed to do the Ascension of Jesus Christ in a cartoon format, and the newspaper said, no, we won't do that because it might offend part of our society and people, and Combine made it would be nice if they had the same consideration to the follow-up cartoons, which they did publish, and just juxtaposition there. So thank you very much.
What was question 1?
One about how to learn about hate crimes and legislature, and how do we as citizens become more aware about it?
More remedies, actually. Like in terms of what the authorities, police, like what remedies is Alberta actually taking to address those issues? What bills and acts do we have in place that are actually dealing with them in court? Because they seem to get brushed under the rug quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
And the cops don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Do we bring them up? Do we not? We do bring them up, but they don't. And they don't press charges either.
Right.
Yes.
So do you want me to? because I'll tie it into the peace conflict, and then I'm going to do a shameless plug for the Calgary Peace Prize right now. So this year we're going to give it to Justice Rosalie Abella for a lot of her work on inclusivity and fighting against discrimination in Canada, particularly around women's issues and some Native issues. Part of the Peace Prize I'm going to be bringing in speaker Barbara Perry, who's an expert. I would call her the expert in Canada on hate crimes, from OISE, Ontario Institute of Studies in Education. Right. So I welcome you to come to her lecture, where you'll learn a lot about hate crimes. I'm not an expert in this area, but when you look at her work and when she speaks about it, basically, CSIS and the RCMP do have a hate crimes sort of unit. She convincingly, I think, argues that it's not a very accurate set of statistics that are produced by our institutions on this issue. Sometimes what they will not call hate crime is clearly a hate crime. Sometimes they'll think some issue doesn't reach the level that it should be counted as a crime, or something like that. So she uses a number of different methods to garner what the numbers actually look like. Year in and year out in Canada, as it is in the US, but let's just speak about Canada, it's white supremacists and white nationalists that commit the greatest number of hate crimes in Canada. It's not even close. And actually, as far as I know, the Jewish community is still the #1 target, not the Muslim community. I think the Jewish community comes first, usually the Muslim community right after them. I'm not sure what they're like this year or the last year, so I'm looking forward to her talk in April when she comes along with Justice Rosalie Abella and informs us about this issue. But so she's quite critical of our local and national institutions that are in charge of counting hate crimes and how they count it. So there's work to do in those institutions in terms of doing that properly. The U.S. suffers from similar problem. One of the interesting things about the U.S.'s way of counting hate crimes and terrorist attacks, you'll find in their own internal documents, you'll see Christian terrorists, Jewish terrorists, Muslim terrorists, etc. Those other terrorists don't reach the level of public discourse. It's only the Muslim ones that reach the level. But internally, they don't actually try to distinguish. Right? So they'll try to call things by their name internally, because their mandate is to make sure that no group uses violence outside of the legitimate monopoly of the state. Right? So there's a lot of interesting things to look at there. And just to answer your question about the minor in peace and conflict studies, so I try to cover some of these issues in my classes. I can't go into every class and say you have to cover it. The requirement for the minor is to get an understanding on Indigenous settler relations. So that's the only one that I can make everyone who gets that minor study. Others, like Islamophobia or other issues like this, hate crimes, they'll be covered in some classes, but not others. Clearly, if you're doing a World War II course, which is part of the minor, you're probably not going to get it there, and understandably so. But hopefully you will have gotten in some other courses at MRU. But when I had to pick the one issue that I wanted them to do, I thought that one was the #1 issue, Indigenous settler relations. So those are the required courses of the minor. But we're still growing it. Who knows where it will lead as we move forward. Thank you.
Peace is not part of the Alberta curriculum in schools. We teach from war to war to war. We don't teach from peace to peace to peace. So this is a really significant conversation when we talk about that. I mean, if we go back to the notion of Jim Kingstra and the hearings and his firing, the anti-Semitic teacher who said here in Alberta that the Holocaust didn't exist, if we applied all the conversation about Islamophobia, if that same indignation could be reached that created the hate crime laws, the hate speech laws here in Alberta, that would be very significant. But we don't even hear even a utterance about hate speech when it's regarding Islamophobia, and I think that's really concerning. We also, we do have a pretty cool bunch of cops here in Calgary, and they really do work with the Muslim community quite closely. But there's still, I was just dealing with a very close friend of mine, a Muslim family whose child was assaulted in a fight at school by a non-Muslim kid. And when they were telling me the story and the police coming, what I started to see, there's, you know, schools have little police people that come in and out, usually looking for drugs, but sometimes they come in for other things. But what I saw, that what I listened to what the police was saying and how the police person was treating the kid, the Muslim kid who got assaulted, what I was hearing was I was almost hearing like, it's your fault you got raped kind of thing that a person would say to a woman with a short skirt. And that's what was being told to this boy, that it was sort of his fault that he got beat up. And yet it was clearly the fault of the person who beat him. And when I said to my friend, I said, I think this is an Islamophobic issue. I think this is about hate. And she was very reticent to recognize that, which tends to be what happens to victims. You know, they might name the assault, but they're very uncomfortable about calling it a hate crime. And so we've now worked through it, and the police who've been brought involved have started to go over the language of the school cop that was there, and it was clearly Islamophobic. And so this becomes also, and this is what I call it, critical friends. And if we as a group, and certainly you are with this group, Rosemary, but this idea of becoming a critical friend to people that might need assistance, to be a support system so that they are not always the ones feeling that they're naming it. I know with feminism, it was nice when men would talk about it. And I just think it's about naming it. If we see something that we validate the person who's having this, because sometimes hate crimes aren't that, you're uncomfortable about them, and you're not quite sure, is it me or is it me? And so that becomes really important.
Not really. I guess besides the legal issue, I simply want to say that maybe we should also do something about media, because media actually is somewhere we actually see these consciously or unconsciously actually hate towards Muslims or Islamophobia is being produced and reproduced by misinformation. So the legal issue is definitely something, but perhaps we could also do something in order to prevent these crimes to happen, because much of these things happen actually out of ignorance, right, or misinformation. Some of the guys actually who do crimes against Muslims, perhaps they are victims of misinformation by media they get. So we should probably do something about this. And I just repeat myself, education, education, education.
Our Syrians have it all the time. One of our Syrian families had a Syrian little sticker on the side of their van that they were very proud of, and had a van donated to them, and it was smashed. The back window was smashed, and it cost $800 to replace that windshield. That was the family's rent for the month, and it was really quite a concern. There is no infrastructure in Calgary that that we could tap into to protect victims of violence, and so that, I mean, there's a long way to go. It's very much a problem.
Okay, so my question is regarding the connection between Canadian foreign policy and Islamophobia. I think that's a critical connection. Canada tends to follow the US foreign policy, supporting an attitude of Islam is terrorism, war on terror, Muslims are the enemy. Millions of Muslims have been killed in these wars of aggression and intervention. The Liberal government is studying Islamophobia as mandated by Motion 103. If the government fails to make the connection with their own foreign policy and the existence of Islamophobia in Canada, will this be anything more than a superficial exercise?
Well, it's a tough one. Obviously, there's the let's wait and see what they say part of it. I'm still one to argue, though, as I mentioned in the talk, there is, of course, Canadian interest and strategic interest in the Middle East and in other predominantly Muslim regions. It still pales in comparison to the US. It's very difficult to know how much sometimes what a particular government's foreign policy is doing or saying in terms of, are they doing that or saying that just because they don't want to upset the Americans and because they need the Americans on this other thing that is totally unrelated to this, or whether it has their own specific strategic interest. So it's always very tricky whenever you're talking about Canadian foreign policy, which I admittedly don't pay as much attention to as I do to American ones. But when you're talking about Canadian foreign policy, often you'll find them just trying not to piss off the US because they need something else from them. Just even in the last year, how careful they are with what Trudeau has, how careful he has been with what his cabinet says about Trump. They obviously don't think much of him. They obviously don't like him. But they're very careful publicly what they say and they don't say about that because of the NAFTA deal, right? So a lot of Canadian foreign policy is usually difficult to figure out precisely because it's not that strong, and it's always we do have the world's imperial center right next door, and we are obviously dependent on them for many things. So I. Probably not going to show up in their findings or whatever, but let's sort of wait and see and then criticize it. But I doubt that it will be something that features in that. And you'll probably hear the good old Canadian lines of, what everybody expects Canada to say will probably appear in that document. We value multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, fortunately, in 2003, John Chrétien was in power, and he did not actually cooperate with the US to invade Iraq. So there are ways actually Canada can do its own independent, relatively autonomous foreign policy. Traditionally speaking, we know that Canada has been very well known for its foreign policy based on peacekeeping, right? However, things have changed, particularly in post 9/11, and now it's been part and parcel of so-called global war on terror. I think perhaps the Liberal government can change this and go back to the traditional peacekeeping policy. And of course, when it comes to selling arms, of course, I know when you do foreign policy, of course, there are always geopolitics, geostrategic interests. You need to actually create more jobs at home, selling arms. But at the same time, if you really care about human rights, of course, we are a champion of responsibility to protect, R2P. So if that's the case, we should really, really be consistent in our foreign policy and human rights. So that's definitely something we need to do. And it's good for Canada's prestige. Of course, Canada has no colonial history or experience, in the Middle East. So this is a good soft power if they can actually work on this. They should not simply blindly follow the discourse of, the politics of global war on terror or this kind of stuff, right? So there are possibilities in theory, but we have to see what they can do.
If I may just quickly add, with Chrétien, he refused to go to the war, but he also told the Americans, I'll give you more troops in Afghanistan so you can free up your... So we're not always, let's not paint the... Chrétien is a very pragmatic type of politician. He understands... I do think that in foreign policy, I didn't mean to suggest that we're completely following them, but we are limited in what we can do in Canada based on what the Americans would like us to do and not do. So there are always limits to what Canadian prime ministers have always said and done in these kinds of circles.
One of the significant things is fascism Fascism's on my mind a lot since Trump got in. And an ideology like fascism can't grow without support. And the support that fascism also often has is silent. And when you showed the picture of Gramsci above us, and a man who actually wrote that quote when he was in Mussolini's prisons, it occurred to me how many stood silent while fascism happened, how many denied it. I wonder, I'm afraid about incarceration. The Americans now have 100,000 new immigration guards that they've just hired that are creating camps on the borders of Mexico. Most people don't know that. They don't call them camps, but they're camps. We still have camps in the occupied areas of Palestine. And I think when is it time that we speak up? When is it time that we show righteous indignation for humanity? It really bothers me. I don't think we're going to see it with Trudeau. He ain't his daddy. So.
I would like to hear more about your reflections on the links between Islamophobia and U.S. and Canadian policy when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Well, I've seen some of the people at our rallies. We have pro-Palestinian rallies. I think we call them anti-racism rallies, but it's in support of Palestine. And this year, was it the JDL that was there, or the Anti-Defamation League? JDL. It was the JDL. I mean, the JDL was created to fight fascism, and all of a sudden they're yelling at us because we're talking about pro-Palestinian homeland. One of the tragedies that Gramsci and other theorists saw is when oppressed people are finally freed themselves, they turn around and oppress other people. And I think we see that tremendously. I think my people, the Jews, have a very short memory when we start to hear what's being said about the Palestinians. I think I would never say that there's an origin of Islamophobia in the Palestinian Jewish crisis. But then again, the stereotypes are very old and very volatile, and they can't be discounted. So it's hard to link it, I think, to the outside world who are not involved. And you've got an expert, a Palestinian expert here. So I think those that are not not involved with Palestine have more of an Islamophobic hatred of the Palestinians. I think those that are more involved from the inside, it's I would think more territorial. I don't know. What do you think? What do you think?
So, I mean, that question gets at the heart of it. I mean, Edward Said's work is very much about this in the question of Palestine. So we had Orientalism, the question of Palestine covering Islam, all are related, basically are making this similar argument. So a discourse on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in North America is, I'm sorry to say, rubbish. It's just rubbish. Most of it is baseless, lacking in evidence, stereotypical to the T, and highly superficial. And most of it becomes easy to create in this way through the tropes of Islamophobia, of fear of the backward Arab Muslim. So that Spielberg image, right? That's a perfect summary of this whole approach of, see those bad guys, Palestinians? They're the exact same thing as these Al-Qaeda guys that took down 9/11. The same way that you're afraid of them, we're afraid of those guys, and the reasons are the same. They hate our cultures of freedom and blah, blah, blah. They're backwards and barbaric and et cetera, and that's what the conflict is. And all of that is strategic discourse. It's not substantive. It doesn't tell you anything about the conflict itself, its roots, it's the causes for its continuation, which is a whole other presentation. But all it does is keeps people in North America kind of just indifferent to it, and will easily support the Israeli side, because that's where America is, and where Canada is. We live in a country here, this is a pro-Israeli perspective. I mean, it's that simple. The Canadian government is on the Israeli side of this conflict. The American, even more so. The reason that they are has nothing to do with Judeo-Christian values and democracy and none of that talk. They're all strategic interests. So that's strategic interests is what gives sort of continuous need for the Orientalist discourse about Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims to continue to propagate itself. As Chomsky once put it, nobody puts their leg on someone's neck and says, that's what I'm doing right now. I have my leg on someone's neck. They don't say that. They'll come up with a whole story imagining themselves doing something completely other than putting themselves on someone's neck. That's what these kinds of discourses do. They create a set of justifications to continue the colonization and exploitation and displacement of the Palestinian people, who can be dismissed very easily as terrorists. So if you watch any Netanyahu speech, right, his last one to the UN, right, he just goes through ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, as if all of these are all the same, and as if they're all doing the exact same thing, which they don't, right? There's different forms of political Islam. They're not all the same. So there's various differences and debates between them, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but that discourse makes it very convenient to get the average American to go, yeah, right, I'm on the Israeli side because I'm afraid of the terrorists, and so on and so forth. So, you know, that's a big part of the discussion for sure.
Yeah, in the US, as we know, there are at least two major forces to support Israel. One is AIPAC, as you know, a very powerful lobby based on geopolitics and I guess geopolitical interests, right? And there's also a religious force of Christian Zionism. So there is also a very powerful, of course, that's definitely something to consider. Then in Canada, I don't think we have the same things. And I was wondering how we can actually explain Canadian Israeli-Palestinian policy with this respect. Obviously, under the former government, conservative government, there were elements of Christian Zionism, and that's why, of course, the last government was super supportive of Mr. Netanyahu, to the extent that not only we saw Islamophobia, but also Iranophobia. They actually closed an Iranian embassy, and so many other things. Even actually liberals disagree with these policies. This government, of course, is somehow different, but I would say that if we really want to address the real question of Israel and Palestine, we should really talk about the real issue, which is plain and simple: occupation. I mean, let's address this. And then of course, when you address this, of course, we can talk about all sorts of solutions. I mean, two-state solution, one-state solution, what really needs to be done. But obviously, there is no way you can see anything happen at this point under President Trump. I wouldn't see any possibilities at this point. So there are serious debates in this regard, of course. Yeah.
Well, just like you were just saying, how many Palestinians were killed today?
About 7 or 8.
If Al Jazeera doesn't... Oh, if Al Jazeera does not give the news, then we don't get the news from Palestine unless it's against Israel. But we have no news feed that gives us any information about what's happening to the Palestinians at all.
And if I just may add very quickly, sorry, but it's actually, it's not even just a North American thing anymore. Lately this summer, we've become aware of how Israel and Saudi Arabia are becoming BFFs now. The Saudi government probably has a better relationship with the Israelis than they do with the Palestinian Authority. So the strategic interest that you'll find that a lot of countries around the world have stronger strategic interests with Israel than they do with the Palestinians. China as well, right? Forget the old days of the Chinese Red Army training the Palestinians. Those are gone. Apparently, someone was doing a presentation on this not long ago, and they said they still had some of the pictures on the wall and all of that, but on the ground, Chinese companies are much more interested in investment in Israel, as they are more so than they are in the Palestinian lands. Yeah.
Well, I'd like first to make a correction or raise a point with Dr. Mujtaba that Canada has a peaceful peacekeeping history. In fact, if you look at the history, Canada has fought in every colonial war with the exception of Iraq at the time of Jean Chrétien. But then, as Dr. Ayyash pointed out, there was a trade-off where we increased the troop level in Afghanistan. So maybe you can comment on that. Actually, Eve Engler has written a very good book, a short book on the history of Canadian imperialism. And maybe that's worth reading. The second point is about Palestine, that the problem of Palestine is occupation. In a sense, that's true, but may I ask you, when do you think the occupation occurred? What year? Most people would say the occupation occurred in 1967, but in actual fact, the occupation of Palestine occurred in December 1917, when the British occupied Palestine as a proxy for the Zionist movement. So the problem of Palestine is more of ethnic cleansing, the same as the problem in Canada. The third point I'd like to make, and this was raised by Annette in her question, is that, and you got to it at the very last, that Islamophobia doesn't just happen. It serves public policy. That's why there is Islamophobia. It serves the national agenda, both in the US, in Europe, and in Canada. And unfortunately, that's one of the weak points of democracy, is you've got to get support. So how do you get support for your policy? You create fear, whether it's Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or anti-Mexican or whatever, or anti-Chinese, anti-Russian, even anti-German. For example, we saw following the Second World War, Hollywood came up with all these films that stereotype Germans, like they were Nazis. Now, we haven't seen these for a long time, but anyway, I'll stop here. Maybe you'd like to comment on your comments.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to create a clear distinction between peacekeeping policy, whatever that means as a theory or official policy, and the global war on terror, right? The global war on terror, things actually Canada has done in following the US foreign policy in post 9/11, even with its own, I guess, manifest of peacekeeping policy is very different. We could actually talk about what peacekeeping policy means, that's another story, but there's a clear difference between these two discourse and actual politics. That was the basic point. Yeah.
How about Korea? Canada fought in Korea. What was the...
Yeah, I didn't say that Canada has not been involved in any, I guess, intervention. I said peacekeeping policy has been actually manifesto or agenda of Canada's foreign policy. And there are, of course, good examples to suggest that Canada has done this in the past. Perhaps the paradigm shift to some extent happened in post 9/11, to some extent, more or less. And we should address this to fix it in a way, right?
And just to add to that, so, you know, Yves makes some good points, but he also goes a little bit sometimes too far. So, of course, Canada was part of imperial wars because we were under the British Empire, and whatever the empire told us to do, we had to do. There was no choice. It was not until after World War I that Canada finally got independence on its foreign policy. Before that, Canada could not make its own foreign policy. It was part of the Commonwealth. And as part of the Commonwealth, whatever the Queen says, you have to do. They certainly were part of imperial wars, but not as a sovereign nation. So there is a technicality there, but it's an important one. Now, you can say that they participated in other imperial-like wars, like Korea, but they also stayed out of Vietnam. They also fought, obviously, in World War II. So it's not true, of course, to say that Canada is a purely peacekeeping. Our history is full of military wars, right? Like it's just I think nobody denies that. What I think Mustafa is pointing out is that there was a shift starting really in and around the Vietnam War and the opposition to that by the Canadian government to want to play a different kind of role. And there is a legitimate debate between that. And I don't think that it's accurate to paint that as completely false or as a fad, or not as a fad, as a facade to hide imperial intentions. There is a kind of a serious now tradition within the Canadian military of peacekeeping. And there are many examples of this. You know, I meet some of these peacekeepers that come from South Sudan, and they really do try to go and do that kind of work. So there is that side to it. Very interesting comment on how these shifts in how certain ethnicities or religions or whatever are represented in the media given the international situation. So in the United States itself, in Hollywood, I saw this in a documentary once where you kind of had representations of Islam in the early parts of the 20th century that were akin to how Buddhism is represented here, as peaceful, interesting, et cetera, et cetera. It's only after the American interests in the region expand and they take over the old spoils of the British Empire that switches. So you know, it's always interesting about this point with Buddhism and Hinduism. When I bring up in class, for example, an example of Hindu extremists in India, all my students go, "What? Hindus do that? I thought Hindus were just like, you know, living with the peace and nature and not eating cows and being at one with everyone, and they wouldn't hurt a fly," or right? Like, but so all of these kinds of representations are always filtered through a political, I think, a geopolitical perspective for sure.
What we don't learn is how to identify how power works. And it's always, it's important to ask questions in whose best interest is being served. And when we ask that question, it often comes out what we don't want to hear, but we have to identify power doesn't operate alone. It operates in how best interests can be served. And in this world now, it tends to be, it's about capital. It's about capital, bottom line. And so we ask those questions. We also ask the question how we identify those that are going to be oppressed is directly related to what those in power want. And we see that with our First Nations people all the time. And we've seen it continually. And so I think it's very important to start giving ourselves a way of identifying exactly how these things happen. How do these things come to be? It's very, very important.
So now we will just welcome one more question, and after that, if there is any other question from any other person, you can actually contact the speakers after the program. We are really sorry because we are running out of time.
Thanks, I've really appreciated this. Ronnie Leah, I teach critical anti-racism, have been involved with the Women in Black peace movement as a Jewish activist. oasis of peace, Nevi Shalom wa Salam. One of the things that's occurring to me from discussion what's happening with the Syrian children and their isolation from so-called Canadian majority children is the lack of personal contact. Racism works as an objectification, otherization. So the extent to which you don't come to know people as human beings, like yourself, the power relations reinforce this Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, every form of colonialism, every form of racism. So it seems to me, bringing this back down to the ground, it seems to me that as activists here, one of the things we're often engaged in is providing an opportunity for people to speak, person to person, to meet each other, to realize that we actually have common interests, common concerns. I'm thinking of the March of Mothers, the March of Women in Israel-Palestine recently, realizing that Arab and Jewish women had exactly the same interests and the same concerns for peace and for their families and communities. So I guess a final comment would be to take it from the level of the politics down to the level of the interpersonal, that we can make a difference insofar as we interrupt that process of otherizing somebody who's seen as different from us or less than us, and actually build those kinds of relationships of trust and solidarity, realizing that we're all in this together. We do have the same interests.
Agreed.
It's a good note to end on, yeah.
It was really a good ending note. So we now need to close the evening. Once again, we thanks to all the speakers and their presentations, and all of you coming out this evening, just sacrificing your Halloween night. I'm sure you must have collected a lot of chocolates. But we would like to request that please share all the knowledge, everything, whatever you learn from here with the friends, family, and support all kind of like rallies which are in support of Islamophobia, or I must say any kind of this kind of a phobia, to support all these kind of rallies. Also, the network is sponsoring another forum on Wednesday, November 22nd, entitled Sisterhood is Global, Women's Voice on Islamophobia. Then also Husseini Association of Calgary is also organizing a seminar on Hussein Day on 26th of November. This is Sunday, and more information about these events can be actually found on the from outside, and on the registration, actually literature tables. And that's it. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks a lot.